Dr. Uzo-Okoro, thank you so much for being with us this morning, and I will turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, all. Good morning, Major Grunet, and thank you very much for that generous introduction. I come to you from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, so it only makes sense that before we dive into our topic of the day, I tell you a bit about our office and what we do here. So OSTP, as we're called for short, is one of the policy offices within the White House. Some of you may be familiar with the National Security Council, and we work very closely with those. Actually, I focus on civil and commercial space, and the topics that Peter Grunet mentioned fall under those. And my colleague on the national security side focuses on all national security topics. However, given the age in which we live, there are lots of interdependencies in civil and commercial and also a national security space. So we work very closely together, and I've got my tentacles deep in the national security space, actually more than I thought that I would. But OSTP does three things. The first thing we do is to provide the President and others within the Executive Office of the President with advice on scientific, engineering, and technology issues. The second thing we do is to lead the federal government, what we call the interagency, on science and technology policy coordination efforts. And the third thing we do is to serve as a source of scientific and technological analysis and judgment for the President with respect to major policies, plans, and programs of the federal government. So our mission is to maximize the benefits of science and technology to advance health, prosperity, security, and environmental quality, and justice for all Americans. So when I'm in the room, I am focused on all topics from a science and technology lens. And again, my national security colleague is focused on it from a security standpoint. The National Space Council colleagues are looking at it from a broad, all of space policy approach. Now, our portfolios vary in OSTP. You've heard some of the topics I cover. But today, I will focus on in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. It is a new term that I coined last spring because we noticed that there was a focus on on-orbit servicing. There's a focus on in-space manufacturing or mining on the moon. There's a focus on robotic technologies on Mars, and also a focus on some, tugging or grappling activities in GEO. But the technologies and the capabilities are similar. They are all multi-use, if you will. I won't even go to dual use quite yet, but these are multi-use capabilities. So why not bring them all together such that these communities building for these different regions can be more efficient as they develop these technologies. So that's why we define in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing as a suite of capabilities that are used on surfaces of celestial bodies, on orbit, and in the transit parts between these regimes. So it includes everything from inspection to repair to RPO, rendezvous and proximity operations, docking, berthing, relocation, refueling, upgrading, and the whole system, repositioning, undocking, unberthing, until you get to release, departure, reuse, orbit transport and transfer, and even timely removal of debris and debris collection. So before we get to what we've done in this space, we released a strategy that gave a vision for in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing last April. And then last month, we released a follow-on implementation plan, because if you release a vision without a plan, then those are just nice lofty words. But I want to step back and talk a little bit about the history of how we got here. So first, in about May of 2018, OSTP hosted a roundtable with government participants, industry participants, and academic participants to discuss the challenges and opportunities of on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. Now, at the time, there didn't seem to be an overwhelming consensus to develop a national strategy, let alone an implementation plan for the federal government to go ahead and implement. There was consensus to conduct more interagency coordination and technology transfer. And the report released by OSTP after that roundtable provided a series of recommendations to address a spectrum of challenges in on-orbit servicing. However, since then, worldwide interest in on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing capabilities grew. So in November of 2020, NASA actually launched something they called an OSAM initiative, an on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing initiative to coordinate federal stakeholders with equities in these capabilities. And they started having these discussions. The Department of Defense also started pursuing a number of technology development projects that were specific to on-orbit servicing. One of the most popular ones is, DARPA's RSGS program. And OSTP continued studying this topic, one on global trends in technology and another on global trends in developing norms of behavior related to on-orbit servicing, assembly, manufacturing, and also rendezvous and proximity operations. And so what we saw is an era where Hubble and the International Space Station were partly assembled in space by humans, and we were moving to one where on-orbit servicing and assembly was growing. So in October of 2021, I, in collaboration with the Space Council, formed this in space servicing, assembly, manufacturing interagency working group to develop a national strategy. And it supports a document we developed previously called the United States Space Priorities Framework, which is focused on scientific and technological innovation, economic growth, the advancement of human life on Earth using space as a tool, commercial development, rule of law, freedom of navigation, and open markets. And the feedback we received from setting those space priorities and including the importance of servicing on orbit, assembling and manufacturing on orbit, showed that we had an opportunity to set a vision and show US leadership in this area. And research has shown that future modular reconfigurable space system architectures, for instance, will enjoy a higher longevity and return on investment through adaptive mission options, through extended operational lifetimes, and through access to in-space servicing, assembly, manufacturing capabilities. We also know that orbital persistent platforms can provide the in-space infrastructure that is necessary to prove out technologies and capabilities that would help close business cases for commercial providers. So knowing this, we felt it was important to elevate the adoption and maturation of these in-space servicing, assembly, manufacturing architectures and platforms that are key to ensuring sustained US leadership in technological advances in space. So that strategy we released last April builds on some existing investments and a lot of emerging capabilities, and it helps us chart a course for using a national approach to realize the opportunities enabled by ISAM. And the 6 goals that we discussed in the strategy include advancing R&D, prioritizing the expansion of scalable infrastructure. And scalable infrastructure includes digital infrastructure, it includes ground infrastructure. It also obviously includes on-orbit infrastructure as well. The third goal was to accelerate the emerging ISAM commercial industry, we had received feedback that we needed to create a strong demand signal, because when you've got new technologies and capabilities, as you all probably know by now, the government does play a big role in supporting the sector as it grows, as it moves from the nascent stage to a mature sector. And so we made the point of showing support for the commercial sector, not just in the policy, but through the implementation plan that the agencies are now acting on. The fourth goal was to promote international collaboration and cooperation that will help us achieve these goals. The fifth was on prioritizing environmental sustainability as we move forward with these capabilities. Obviously, it makes no sense for us to put more things in space without being respectful of our norm and our principles around our responsible behaviors in use of space. And the sixth goal is to inspire diverse workforce, which we hope is a potential outcome of the innovations surrounding in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. So we see a strategy that cuts across multiple outcomes: remote sensing capabilities on orbit, human exploration and lunar capabilities on the surface of the moon, and the exploration of Mars. And the goal of doing this and sending this message is that, with hope, the strategy empowers U.S. entities with varying interests to develop these multi-purpose technologies that will help enable a thriving space economy, not just here on Earth, but also in space. So when you think about the Biden administration's priorities, one is on COVID, one is on equity, one is on the economy, one is on restoring America's global leadership, another is on climate. What you see there is, with the priority on the economy, we are creating jobs in robotics and software and cloud networks and ground-based communications and additive manufacturing and spacecraft component development companies. And that's one of the outcomes we hope that continues to grow as a result of this strategy. Now, another thing we learned from feedback from the commercial sector is that we needed to improve coordination and collaboration within the U.S. government, as well as, amongst the U.S. government, academia, industry, and international partners. So one of the outcomes and one of the implementation tasks that actually NASA is spearheading now is the development of a consortium that will bring all of these stakeholders with equities and in-space servicing, assembly, manufacturing together, and so that we could be more collaborative and coordinated in our approach. A third one was establishing and adopting ISAM standards to help promote growth. Now, we could have a separate lecture on standard development that's needed for docking, grappling, recycling, collection, RPO, repositioning. And so we're starting those conversations in the agencies, particularly DoD and NASA, with support from Commerce and others, have started determining what new standards need to be developed and adopted and established, and existing standards that we can repurpose for this work. Ultimately, we believe that the space enterprise needs a coordinated and robust roadmap for how to integrate current and future commercial in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing capabilities to address upcoming needs that we have in 3 to 7 years. And I focus on commercial here because they are providing a lot of technology leadership and capability leadership that is beneficial not just to the civil agencies and the Defense Department, but also to the intelligence community. So what we have seen and what we encourage here is the adoption of these technologies from the private sector, so that we, the government, do not have to build inefficiently in-house, and we only build what the private sector does not do. And of course, there are numerous servicing capabilities and technologies like commoditized autonomy, refueling, tugging, as I mentioned earlier. But then the questions that we have, like which of these capabilities should be implemented within the next 5 years? And who are the customers? Which capabilities within servicing, assembly, or manufacturing are most relevant to meet, say, Air Force needs or NASA needs or NRO's needs? And what ISAM priorities within the next budgeting cycles should we prioritize? How do we encourage states, whether they are allied partners or strategic competitors, to develop national guidelines and regulatory frameworks for active debris removal missions and for the implementation of on-orbit servicing missions, period? And how do we disseminate these guidelines internationally? How do we require the removal of existing space debris by countries who put them there? How do we welcome international cooperation on debris removal? I'll stick with that example, including, multilateral fora, and encourage international transparency in these debris removal practices to foster the future development of international guidelines. And on the private sector side, when considering, ways to create a demand signal, what model should the U.S. government apply to its procurement of commercial ICM services? So these are the kinds of questions that we sought to answer in developing the ICM implementation plan that was released last month. We are exploring ways that we should work to advance a servicing culture across the entire space enterprise by, again, not just supporting things like standardization and the adoption of interfaces for servicing, but also to ensure that we are prioritizing space sustainability, and we are focused on how ICM capabilities can mitigate long-lived debris and work towards fostering numerous servicing capabilities and technologies. So I'll give you a few examples of some of the work that we have started. NASA and the Air Force have started work as directed in the National ICM Implementation Plan on how do we define the future missions and architectures that will use ICM capabilities by developing an ICM test or demonstration capability for specific technologies that will be consistent with not just national orbital debris guidelines, but also international debris guidelines. And this work aligns with the National Orbital Debris Implementation Plan, which focused on how we advance and enable technologies for remediation and repurposing, for instance. How do we support the development and validation of end-of-mission capture and relocation interface standards for space objects? Because if you think about the routine implementation on satellites, upper stages, and deployment devices, such a standard may encourage the creation of a market for, again, my go-to example, active debris removal services. And a standard interface may also increase the confidence of some of our government operators and regulators that active debris removal services can be used to satisfy post-mission disposal requirements. And then when you think of going back to the international space, we are looking at considerations of international issues that help us assess the legal frameworks, that help us assess the regulatory frameworks. And these include things like ownership, return, and significant issues that may arise in relation to the Outer Space Treaty and other key space treaties. And while some of these situations may need to be resolved on a case-by-case basis, clarity on the U.S. approach with respect to issues where possible appropriate development of remediation options exist is one that we are focused on. So I've talked about a lot of international questions we're asking, some legal questions. Then on the environmental and strategic side of things, we are also analyzing risks of operationally relevant timescales. What is our risk framework? We don't have one, we're developing one now to include negative effects to space stakeholders that rely on these space-enabled services. How do we convene and when do we convene stakeholders to discuss how their operations may be affected by various on-orbit servicing scenarios? Some of these stakeholders I'm talking about include entities like communications, civil protection, air quality monitoring, oil and gas production, agriculture, ocean monitoring, renewable energies, forestry. How do we develop an economic and strategic risk assessment that would describe near-term harm, quantified in probabilities and also in dollars, that will help us provide an expected value for costs imposed by some of these services in space? How do we assess the size of the market for these services? So these are a lot of the questions we are answering, a lot of the steps that we are taking in an actionable way on in-space servicing, assembly, manufacturing. One more thing I will add is that we are looking to encourage not just international participation by allied nations and strategic competitors. We are also looking at how we can democratize international opportunities. We are looking for how to further develop and use low Earth orbit, which is the prime location for us, the prime accessible location for some of these technologies over the next 7 years. And we are looking for how we can continue to, again, advance the development of the research and the development of the technology so that we can foster, again, U.S. leadership and advancement of these capabilities. So I will stop there for now so that we can have a discussion and I can take your questions.
Well, ma'am, thank you so much for that initial presentation. Incredibly fascinating, right? All of these things related to in-space servicing and manufacturing that you've been discussing. We have had some questions flow into our chat box and Q&A. And so I will begin with this one. Over the course, right, of the last several presidential administrations, but it seems like to a much greater degree in the current Biden administration, there's been this emphasis on the development of norms, tenets, whatever you want to call them, of responsible behavior, right? We've seen that in Secretary of Defense Austin's, right, tenets of responsible behavior for the Department of Defense. We saw that last year, right, with Vice President Harris's announcement of the kinetic kill ASAT testing ban, in various efforts of the Biden administration, right, at the United Nations with respect to these developments of norms or principles of responsible behavior. And so you mentioned, right, during your presentation, ma'am, that in these kind of in-space manufacturing, servicing, orbital operations, one of the things that your office has emphasized is working with international partners and the like to develop a common understanding maybe of some of these norms of responsible behavior. What would you say that your office would like these norms to look like, and how can we best kind of contribute to the development of these norms to protect the very, very valuable economic benefits that in-space servicing, manufacturing, and on-orbit operations can have, not just for the United States, right, but for other countries around the world?
Thank you. There are multiple ways to accomplish a vision, and we are focused on 3 ways. The first is leading by example. That's what we did with the Vice President's announcement of the ban on direct descent anti-satellite testing. The second is, and also it's in us working on these policy, areas and documents, releasing them, having implementation plans, and going ahead and working hard on them. We have received feedback from other allied states that it has been helpful to them, and some of them have already developed similar documents internally and are actively working. So we continue to lead by example because it's the best and fastest and most efficient thing we can do. The second option that we continually use is bilateral relationships and meetings. And so we have had, and obviously we're doing this mostly with allied partners. We've had a number and continue to have these bilateral conversations with allied partners on what we can do together and how we can expand the reach of some of these guidelines that we are developing internally within the US. And then obviously the third way is a multilateral approach. And you're probably familiar with the UN and COPIUS and the long-term sustainability guidelines that were determined. I will speak to an example of something that started out in the 80s in the US government. The DoD and NASA put together the Orbital Debris Mitigation Standards and Practices, called ODMSP for short. And eventually other nations through the IADC adopted those standards and practices. Those were released in 2001 and then eventually updated in 2019. We may be looking at an update soon. What we see is, while it moves at a slower pace, the multilateral fora is an avenue for us to get partners and other states to adopt elements and guidelines that we have considered or tried in-house. And so to answer your question specifically, what we are hoping to see is, well, two things. One is other states adopting our principles around responsible norms and behavior in space. And these principles are, a lot of them are nicely articulated in the Artemis Accords. And so we work hard to, I think last month we had the first 2 African nations to join the Artemis Accords, Rwanda and Nigeria, as part of the first ever space forum that we held with the US Africa Leaders Summit that the president held last month. So those set of principles are one where we have already determined and had some allied partners join. I think we've got over 21 signatories at this time who are supportive of and agree to use the same principles that we have in the responsible use of space. Now, other norms, some are not for the slow side, and others that are still in discussion of, ways that we could bring in other nations to support behaviors and principles that we see as necessary for the current era of development in space, activities in space, and collaborative activities in space today.
I think our next question to some degree dovetails a little bit with the answer that you just provided. This question is from Mr. Mark Meyer, and he asks, how can the ITU, right, the International Telecommunications Union for our listeners, and UNUSA, the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, or others, help to work towards finding interoperable technical and legal standards for on-orbit servicing and debris recycling specifically? I think, again, that sort of dovetails with your previous answer, but anything that you can say on that question specifically, ma'am?
I think this question is more about process, and we just have to follow the process. You start by getting people in the room. She gets people, states in the room and asks what states have done. And usually what happens with topics that have this kind of extreme complexity is every state goes home and then does their homework. Have we assessed the legal ramifications of this? Have we done the economic assessment, the strategic assessment, the regulatory assessment? Do we have a framework? Not just a policy framework, but again, a regulatory, legal one, and a strategic one. And then they come back to the table and this multilateral table and offer their options. We do that here internally, obviously on a national scale, but on an international scale, it's even more important that states are given a seat at the table to have these discussions, brainstorm approaches that based on what they are doing in their home states, and come up with an international guideline. So, I've given a 20-second answer, but this is a process that takes, months and months. And we just need to, get that work going. And I think some of it has already begun.
Our next question, perhaps maybe a bit more technical and a quasi multi-part question. I will go ahead and read it, and then we can either take the questions maybe one by one, or I can rephrase. This is a question from Dawson Lightfoot, writing September of 2022, China claims to have returned helium-3 from the moon. Artemis 1, right, succeeded in December of 2022, right, proving the ability to get back to the moon. And the Department of Energy also announced an announcement related to fusion ignition of, I think, space systems. And so the question is, can you comment at all on any urgency related to helium-3 as a contributing factor to kind of a new space race, perhaps, between us and other strategic competitors or other states within the international system? And kind of more broadly, are there any other known materials on the moon that are strategically valuable, perhaps even more valuable than helium-3? So really a question about whether helium-3 is contributing to some sort of new international space race, and then just more generally, this question of valuable materials on the moon and lunar resources. Can you speak to that question, ma'am?
Let's make sure we remember that the question starts with an underlining presumption of a claim by a strategic competitor, and answering the question with that claim in mind. One notes that we have research that shows that there are several elements on the surface of the moon that could be strategically important, could be economically important, and we continue to support and advance research and development, technology development that will foster services on the lunar surface and around the moon. We have a cislunar strategy that you should take a look at if you haven't, that was released a few months ago. And so this is something we, from the policy standpoint, are taking seriously. And by this, I mean all of cislunar space in our strategy to advance US leadership. Now, as far as a specific element that we think is strategically more important than the others, none at this time. So I think that we are very clear in our vision and in our intention to lead on a number of activities in cislunar space.
Our next question comes from Andrew Bacrow, and he writes, given the international community cannot fully commit, right, to a wide array of other kind of international agreements on various things, including, for instance, the Paris Climate Agreement, what do you think about the overarching possibility within the space sector for the international community to kind of learn from these past mistakes and generate better international cooperation, better international norms and policies for governing some of these on orbit and in space issues?
That's a great question. And I think that's actually happening. So, the last question mentioned a space race, and I didn't touch on it because frankly, we're not really thinking in that way anymore. We're thinking more in line of what was asked in this question, which is how do we go together? There are, and I can give you lots of examples of how that is very clear in our thinking. Obviously, we will continue to advance US leadership. We will continue to work with allied partners in other states and are not abandoning any orbit or any area in space, but we are looking to provide even more international opportunities that we can to others who want to become spacefaring nations, want to increase their spacefaring capabilities. Specifically on the question, there are, all the activities I've talked about, whether it's us leading by example, whether it's our bilateral conversations or, the conversations in a multilateral forum. We're actually preparing for a number of them this year. Now, we are doing exactly that, just having conversations and thinking about what we can bring to the table, not just to show leadership, but also to collaborate with others.
Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. And this question relates to possible risks or threats to space systems, right, private or public or governmental. And so this question is, what are your thoughts, ma'am, on legal and financial liability issues related to possible space debris impact when that debris is identifiable? So, for example, if you could trace, for instance, the debris from a particular anti-satellite test. So we saw the Indian test in 2019, we saw the Russian test in 2021. If there was an identifiable piece of space debris that damaged or impacted a commercial or other unclassified space mission, what are your thoughts with respect to the legal and financial liability issues, which I know are kind of more legal and less technical? But if you could speak to the technical questions related to these threats of space debris as well, could you offer your thoughts on that?
So we are currently developing some of these, some of our approaches to this. But you have to recognize and acknowledge the extreme complexity here. There are also a lot of assumptions here. The first is that, one, we can identify what piece of debris belongs to what nation. We are not able to do that yet on the civil side, on the commercial side for everything. The second is, what are the operational considerations here? Is there human life involved? The ASAT test that was done 2 Novembers ago, November of 2021, is an example of an incident where, we had human life that had to shelter in place. We have processes in place to respond to that, and we did. And then you think of the regulatory component of that, the owner of said debris, if we do know the owner picking up the debris, and then we'd have to go to, if it's a different country, if this is US owned debris, United States owned debris, whether it's government or commercial, hitting another US entity as property, then that's an internal discussion that we could perhaps handle on a case-by-case basis, as I mentioned. So in that scenario, we could handle it in-house. But if you introduce another state, then you have the question of well, what are the international norms for accepting liability? What are the legal ramifications of that? What are the strategic ramifications of that? So I've got more questions for you than answers on this line, but those are the things that we consider when we run through those scenarios, and we do have responses for them.
Ma'am, our next question involves something that you briefly mentioned during your main presentation, which was this question of multi-use technologies. And so you mentioned a number of possible technologies during your presentation, on-orbit servicing just being one example, but you mentioned, for example, orbital tugs that could move things around from various orbits into geo or outside of them, and things of that nature. And this question involves, right, the not overly recent now, but last year's kind of example of the tug technology that was implemented by the Chinese. The Chinese used, right, one of their orbital tugs to remove a defunct satellite from a lower orbit into a higher graveyard orbit. Could you speak to this concern about dual use technologies and maybe methods by which, obviously technology is technology, it's right, it just is, right? You can use it for various things, both good and bad. But does your office have any suggestions, ma'am, as to addressing this question or this fear of dual use technology in order to maybe assuage some of the worries that either other countries have with respect to maybe US space technologies, or that the US might have to other countries' space technologies?
Because at the most basic level, I think that we have a responsibility. I mean, Major Grant, your audience are future leaders of not just the US military, but also of this country. And speaking to you as a future leader, you have a responsibility to see a fear as an opportunity. So how do we turn it to an opportunity? And what we do is we lead by example. I keep coming back to that because that's one of the best things we can do. And with in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, we have shown that we can use robotics technology, sensor technology for trusted autonomy. We can also use it for refueling. We can also use it for docking. We can use it in low Earth orbit for the companies that are building the next generation of space stations. And we can use it for some national security applications in cislunar space. So once that is communicated and is clear to our allied partners that there are some opportunities to use dual use technologies in a way that benefits multiple applications, multiple sectors, I think that's the first step. The second step is a mindset change here. A number of the questions have started with the strategic competitor is doing X. What are we doing? And I challenge you to change the mindset to what does the United States need to do to meet our goals, to meet our values, to meet our priorities, and to exist in this international enterprise that we call space. But the third is to think about the challenges that are real challenges, that are not fears that can be made into opportunities, that are not a mindset change, but things that are actually real challenges that we need to solve, that involve keeping American lives safe in space and here on the ground, ensuring that we have peaceful and responsible use of space. I'll add one more word to that: the peaceful, safe, and responsible use of space.
Well, ma'am, thank you so much for that answer, because I think that, as you very astutely noted, we, especially the U.S. military, are perhaps a bit more reactive and like to see what other people are doing and then respond to it. So I definitely appreciate that response, because I think it gets.
I would change that a bit, because I'm not a member of the military. I spent 17 years at NASA and I've spent 2 years at the White House. So I have been able to work with some of you. And this country is great because of all of you that we have in the military. And what I've seen from a lot of your leaders is not a preoccupation with other states, but a preoccupation with how we defend our values, how we lead with our values, and how we continue to, with the OSTP mindset, pioneer in science and technology in space and elsewhere. So I do see it there. I don't think it's the entire military, including yourself, Major Grenade. I mean, I do see an interest and a desire to use these capabilities, to use American ingenuity, to use all the advantages we have here, the rule of law, the commercial innovation and growth, and growth of not just companies, but growth in our thinking within the government, outside of the government, in academia, and not-for-profit organizations in the military, of what we can be and how we can use our values and our, whether it's soft power, global power, space power, to advance not just the lives of American citizens, but also the lives of people largely here in the world.
So we have had another named question flow into the chat. And this question is from Christophe Bosquion. And sir, I hope I've pronounced your last name correctly. Apologies if I did not. Christophe writes, regarding access to and benefit sharing of space activities by emerging countries and companies worldwide, can we think of an international benefit sharing regime of some sort that would perhaps accelerate the space development of these emerging countries and companies? And he says, for example, STEM education, some form of authorized tech transfers, at least for non-sensitive technology, et cetera. Anything that you can say, ma'am, about these possible benefit sharing regimes to encourage the development of space activities by emerging countries and companies?
Yeah, you know, the best example I can think of, it's a great question, which excites me, is the International Space Station. We are looking to, and we have announced we are transitioning it and retiring it by the end of this decade. We did something similar in my short career, which was retire the space shuttle, but there was a gap, right, between the replacement by a US private company, and we are hoping to prevent that gap. And there have been lots of stories with the use of the International Space Station as this beacon of international collaboration, not just government to government, but also private companies, in my example, US private companies working with other nations that we may not typically think of as the first partner of choice to conduct their research in space. And as some of these companies are prototyping and building what we hope to be the replacement of the International Space Station, we have seen even more countries come forward, because one has to, again, as an American leader, one has to think of how we not only remain the partner of choice, but the center of gravity for activities, in this case, in low Earth orbit using infrastructure. And we have already seen instances of other nations in the Middle East, for instance, going to these companies to either transport their astronauts, transport their cargo, and conduct their research in space. So I think that we are in a good place. We could use more examples like that, obviously. Come on over and give me some ideas if you have more of what we can be doing to encourage more of that behavior. But we're seeing it, and it's very exciting.
Dr. Uzo-Okoro, thank you so much for your time, ma'am. Do you have any final thoughts?
Thank you for having me. Thank you for serving our great country. And thank you for your leadership. You keep all of us safe. And I know that some of you or all of you will continue to do great things for our nation. So thank you very much for your service.